The city of New York in the 1920s was a place of constant movement, a living organism fueled by ambition, desperation, and the endless hum of possibility. Its streets were crowded with immigrants chasing the American dream, yet for many, opportunity was a distant promise, replaced instead by the harsh reality of survival in a world ruled by force, cunning, and fear. In the shadows of tenements and the back alleys of lower Manhattan, gangs carved out territories, each vying for control of vice, liquor, and influence. Violence was not just a means of settling disputes, it was a language, a currency, a way of communicating power when words failed or were insufficient. Within this crucible, individuals were forged by both environment and necessity, sharpened by the unforgiving rhythm of street life, where each day could bring fortune or death. Among the many children growing up amidst this chaos, there emerged a boy whose eyes were not content merely to observe the world around him. He watched carefully, measured the strength of men and the weakness of institutions, and absorbed lessons that others learned only after pain and loss. The city's disorder was not a deterrent for him, it was a template. Each corner, each illegal transaction, each whispered deal became a blueprint for understanding human behavior, power, and influence. While his peers were often consumed by petty crime or fleeting ambitions, he recognized patterns, the way loyalty could be bought and fear could be manufactured, and the delicate equilibrium required to balance trust and intimidation. He began to see the possibilities not as isolated events but as parts of a larger architecture of control, a system that could be designed, managed, and optimized. The hum of machinery, the clatter of horse-drawn carts giving way to automobiles, and the cacophony of voices in dozens of languages created a backdrop to this young man's formative years. Every street corner told a story of struggle, every barroom a microcosm of politics and power. Speakeasies, hidden behind unmarked doors and shuttered windows, offered more than illegal liquor, they were hubs of negotiation, alliances, and betrayal. Here, lessons were not learned in classrooms but in the subtleties of human interaction, where a glance, a tone, or a handshake could decide life or death. He observed how men navigated these invisible codes, how respect was earned, and how authority could be asserted without a single shot fired. Each interaction added to his understanding of hierarchy, influence, and control, the same principles that would later define an entire criminal empire. In this world, ambition was not inherently noble, it was survival. To rise above the countless others who clawed through the streets, one had to combine intellect, instinct, and an unerring sense of timing. He saw the value in patience, in observing rivalries unfold, in allowing the chaos around him to reveal weaknesses and opportunities. Fear, he realized early, was a tool more powerful than brute strength. It could be wielded subtly, almost invisibly, bending men to will and ensuring compliance without constant confrontation. Power, when executed with precision, became a form of art, a careful orchestration of psychology, circumstance, and leverage. And in these lessons, taken not from textbooks but from life itself, he began to craft a vision, a world in which disorder could be harnessed, reshaped, and controlled, a world where intelligence and strategy would outweigh mere muscle and brutality. Yet even as he observed and learned, New York remained a city of extremes. The divide between wealth and poverty was stark, and the law was often as unpredictable as the criminals it sought to restrain. Corruption seeped through political offices, police precincts, and courtrooms, creating a landscape where rules were malleable, and loyalty could be bought or coerced. For those with vision, such as this boy, the environment presented not only obstacles but unparalleled opportunity. He understood that power was not static, it had to be cultivated, tested, and defended against those who would seek to usurp it. Every small victory, every avoided conflict, every successful negotiation was a step toward mastery, and he moved through the city like a student of human nature, absorbing, calculating, and preparing for the moment when he would no longer be merely a participant in the chaos but its architect. By the time he reached young adulthood, he had already begun to synthesize what others failed to grasp. The city's underworld was a system, with patterns and structures that could be understood, manipulated, and ultimately dominated. While many reacted impulsively, driven by anger, jealousy, or greed, he operated with foresight, patience, and meticulous calculation. His ambition was no longer reactive, it was premeditated. Every alliance he formed, every rivalry he navigated, every illicit venture he engaged in was a move in a much larger design, a blueprint of control that would eventually redefine organized crime. The streets that had shaped him, harsh and unforgiving, had also taught him strategy, diplomacy, and the intricate psychology of power. It was here, amid the clamor, danger, and opportunity, that the foundation of his legacy was quietly being laid, unseen by most, but destined to reshape the world around him. Before Lucky Luciano rose to prominence, New York's criminal underworld was a chaotic, fractured landscape, a battleground where ambition often collided with brutality and the rules of engagement were written in blood. The Mafia of the early 20th century was not a monolithic force, it was a loose collection of families and gangs, each protecting its own interests, each enforcing its own code, yet often blind to the larger picture. Violence was omnipresent and unregulated, with territorial disputes erupting into open street wars. Rivals settled scores through assassinations, kidnappings, and extortion, often with devastating consequences for bystanders who happened to cross paths with these power struggles. Law enforcement, for its part, was overwhelmed, underfunded, and, in many cases, corrupt. Officers would accept bribes, turn a blind eye, or even actively collude with criminals, further muddying the boundaries between crime and governance. In this world, power was a fleeting, fragile commodity, constantly challenged by unpredictable alliances and betrayals. The early Mafia thrived on fear and reputation, relying heavily on the threat of violence to enforce loyalty. But these methods were inconsistent and unsophisticated. Leadership often depended on brute force rather than strategic thinking. Gangsters could rise quickly through audacity or luck, but they fell just as easily when rival factions challenged their authority or when alliances fractured. This lack of cohesion created a vicious cycle of instability, where power was never secure, and the consequences of miscalculation were often fatal. It was a world defined less by foresight than by impulse, and those who sought dominance had to navigate treacherous waters, constantly testing friends and enemies alike. For many ambitious criminals, the environment seemed simultaneously full of opportunity and impossibly dangerous. The chaos of the underworld was exacerbated by prohibition, which had transformed New York into a goldmine of illicit opportunity. Speakeasies, bootlegging operations, and underground gambling dens proliferated across the city, and gangs competed fiercely to control these lucrative markets. Yet despite the wealth these enterprises generated, the profits were rarely organized efficiently. Disputes over territory, revenue, and influence led to frequent bloodshed, and cooperation between families was rare. The Mafia functioned more as a collection of isolated warlords than a coordinated network. Every deal was precarious, every alliance temporary, and every enemy a potential threat to life and livelihood. In this environment, violence was not just a tool of power but a constant reality, shaping behavior, alliances, and decisions. Amid this disarray, there were glaring weaknesses that a perceptive mind could exploit. Many of the older, established mob bosses relied on tradition, adhering rigidly to inherited methods of control without adapting to a rapidly changing urban landscape. They underestimated the importance of strategic planning, financial oversight, and psychological manipulation. They dealt with problems reactively, responding to threats with immediate force rather than long-term solutions. The result was inefficiency, unpredictability, and vulnerability, a vulnerability that an emerging visionary could recognize and capitalize upon. To truly dominate, one needed more than muscle, one needed structure, foresight, and the ability to anticipate both opportunity and danger. Beyond the internal conflicts of the Mafia, external pressures also shaped the criminal ecosystem. Political machines, law enforcement, and reformist movements periodically intervened, sometimes threatening the fragile stability of the gangs. Investigations, raids, and prosecutions were sporadic but intense, forcing gangs to be constantly vigilant. The threat of incarceration or deportation hung over every major operation, making loyalty and discretion essential commodities. Yet even these external pressures were imperfectly managed, often unevenly applied, and susceptible to manipulation. For a calculated leader, these weaknesses could be leveraged to consolidate power, forge advantageous alliances, and outmaneuver rivals who lacked the same vision. The disunity of the underworld also revealed the psychological dimension of power. Fear and intimidation alone were insufficient to create lasting control. Trust was scarce, loyalty even scarcer, and betrayal a constant specter. Many ambitious figures failed not because they lacked courage or resources, but because they did not understand the intricate human dynamics required to maintain authority. Success required more than intimidation, it demanded insight into human behavior, the capacity to read motives, predict reactions, and orchestrate relationships. Those who could combine cunning with strategy were rare, and those who succeeded left a lasting mark on the structure of organized crime. Into this fractured and violent environment stepped Lucky Luciano, a figure whose intelligence, charisma, and ambition allowed him to see what others could not. He observed the weaknesses of the old guard, the inefficiencies of traditional operations, and the chaos of unchecked ambition. He recognized that the fragmented system could be reorganized into something more resilient, more profitable, and more controlled. Where others saw random violence, he saw patterns. Where they relied on fear alone, he imagined loyalty engineered through strategy. The very chaos that destroyed so many of his predecessors became a canvas upon which he would paint a new vision of power, one that would transform the underworld from a collection of volatile street gangs into a disciplined, corporate-style organization capable of enduring scrutiny, conflict, and the passage of time. The world before Luciano was one of unpredictability and danger, a proving ground where only the most adaptable survived. It was a world where alliances shifted like sand, violence erupted without warning, and opportunities were both fleeting and treacherous. And yet, it was precisely this environment that nurtured his abilities, honed his instincts, and set the stage for a revolutionary approach to organized crime. The chaos, the fear, and the inefficiency of the early Mafia would serve as both his education and his opportunity. By understanding the flaws of the old system, he would be able to impose a new order, one that would endure far beyond his own lifetime, reshaping the underworld into a legacy of architecture, strategy, and power. The story of Lucky Luciano begins not with headlines or notoriety, but in the crowded, teeming streets of Lower East Side Manhattan, where the scent of sweat, smoke, and ambition hung heavy in the air. Born in 1897 to Sicilian immigrants, he entered a world of poverty and struggle, where opportunity was scarce and survival demanded cunning as much as courage. The tenements were densely packed, families crammed into small apartments, their lives defined by the rhythms of necessity, work, school, and the constant negotiation of the streets. For many children, the streets were both playground and battleground, a place where lessons were learned not from books but from observation and experience. From a young age, Luciano absorbed the sights and sounds of this environment, the shouting of vendors, the sharp bark of policemen, the quiet whispers of deals made in shadowed corners, and internalized them as the grammar of power. Family life offered both stability and tension. While his parents instilled values of loyalty, honor, and work ethic, the harsh realities of immigrant existence constantly tested these lessons. Young Charles Lucky Luciano, as he would later be known, learned quickly that intelligence and agility could equal opportunity where money and status did not exist. He witnessed his father navigating financial hardships, his mother managing a household under constant strain, and neighbors striving to carve out a life amidst overcrowding, disease, and crime. These early experiences sharpened his instincts for survival and negotiation. He became acutely aware of the dynamics of power within human relationships, who commanded respect, who could be manipulated, and who was vulnerable. It was a psychological education, imparted not in classrooms but through observation, trial, and consequence. The neighborhood itself was a crucible, a place where the social and criminal worlds collided constantly. Gangs controlled blocks, extortion was common, and minor crimes escalated quickly into life-altering consequences. Luciano's early interactions with peers and older street figures exposed him to the subtle interplay of fear and respect. He watched how rivalries formed, how reputations were established, and how loyalty could be both demanded and earned. Every altercation, every negotiation, every act of defiance or submission became part of a larger tapestry of understanding, a blueprint for maneuvering in a world where one misstep could be fatal. Even as a boy, he began to calculate moves ahead, observing not only the immediate effects of actions but the long-term consequences, anticipating reactions before they occurred. Education offered its own lessons, though not always in the conventional sense. Schoolrooms provided a temporary escape from the chaos of the streets, yet the lessons of formal learning were often dwarfed by the lessons learned outside. Mathematics, reading, and writing had their uses, particularly in calculating earnings, debts, and logistics for small criminal operations. But the true education came in the form of social intelligence, situational awareness, and psychological acuity. Luciano learned how to read expressions, interpret tones, and navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, all skills that would later underpin his mastery of organized crime. The streets, in this sense, became his classroom, and every encounter a case study in human behavior, power, and influence. By adolescence, Luciano had already begun dipping into the margins of criminal activity. Petty thefts, pickpocketing, and small-time scams were not just crimes, they were exercises in strategy, risk assessment, and leadership. He tested boundaries, evaluated responses, and learned the limits of authority. Each success reinforced his confidence, each failure offered critical insight into human behavior and organizational weakness. Unlike many of his peers, he was not content with reactive or opportunistic crime. He studied patterns, observed the mistakes of others, and cultivated a sense of timing and foresight that would become central to his later success. Every street corner, every gang interaction, became both a challenge and an opportunity to refine his skills and understand the underlying structure of power. Equally formative were the mentors and figures he encountered in these early years. Older criminals, some hardened by decades of street life, served as both models and cautionary tales. Luciano observed their methods, both effective and flawed, noting how some relied purely on intimidation, while others combined cunning with patience and strategic alliances. He learned the importance of choosing associates carefully, understanding that loyalty was transient and that influence was earned, not demanded. These lessons, absorbed in the raw environment of the city, gave him an early blueprint for leadership, one that balanced fear, respect, strategy, and calculated risk in ways that many of his contemporaries would never grasp. By the time he reached his late teens, Luciano's ambitions were no longer confined to the streets of Manhattan. He recognized the limitations of small-time operations and began envisioning a broader scope, a world where crime could be organized, systematic, and profitable on a scale beyond simple theft or extortion. The chaotic, fragmented underworld he had observed was, in his mind, a puzzle that could be solved, a structure that could be redesigned. He began forming alliances with influential figures, testing the waters of negotiation, and laying the groundwork for a criminal network built not on brute force alone but on organization, intelligence, and psychological mastery. His early life, marked by hardship, observation, and strategic experimentation, had prepared him for the monumental task ahead, transforming the violent, disjointed landscape of organized crime into a disciplined, enduring empire. The streets that shaped him were harsh, but they were also instructive. Every conflict, every alliance, every betrayal offered insight into the human psyche, the mechanisms of influence, and the dynamics of power. By internalizing these lessons, Luciano cultivated a mindset that combined street savvy with strategic thinking, instinct with planning, and ambition with discipline. It was a rare combination, one that allowed him to perceive opportunities where others saw only danger, and to orchestrate relationships where others relied solely on fear. The foundations of his future empire were laid not in boardrooms or through formal education, but in the daily crucible of Lower East Side life, a life that demanded resilience, ingenuity, and an unerring sense of timing. As Lucky Luciano moved from adolescence into young adulthood, the streets of New York became both his playground and his proving ground. By this time, he had absorbed every lesson the tenements and alleys could teach, honing his instincts, his awareness of human behavior, and his ability to calculate risk. But knowledge alone did not command respect in the underworld. It was action, audacity, and the ability to navigate danger that marked the beginning of influence. Luciano's first real steps into crime were both natural and deliberate. He started with petty theft, small cons, and shoplifting, activities that required agility, timing, and a careful reading of both people and environment. These minor infractions were more than survival mechanisms, they were exercises in strategy, teaching him to anticipate consequences, assess vulnerabilities, and exploit weaknesses with precision. Bootlegging became his first real taste of power and profit. The era of prohibition had transformed New York into a city awash with illicit alcohol, and opportunity flowed to those bold enough to seize it. Speakeasies proliferated behind unmarked doors, hidden cellars, and secret staircases, catering to a population eager to defy the law. Luciano recognized that bootlegging was more than supplying liquor, it was a business with its own complex network of supply, demand, and territorial control. He began to understand the importance of logistics, where shipments came from, how they could be protected, and how alliances could be leveraged to ensure smooth operations. Every transaction was a test of both skill and trust, and each successful deal reinforced his growing reputation as a man who could combine intelligence with courage to achieve results. The early criminal networks he entered were fragmented, often violent, and notoriously unpredictable. Rivalries flared without warning, and alliances were as fragile as they were necessary. Luciano quickly learned that survival depended not just on personal skill, but on the careful cultivation of allies. He began to surround himself with men whose loyalty could be earned, whose abilities complemented his own, and whose ambitions aligned, at least temporarily, with his vision. He observed patterns of loyalty and betrayal, noting which individuals could be trusted and which were likely to fracture under pressure. These early partnerships were microcosms of the empire he would one day construct, providing lessons in negotiation, influence, and the delicate balance between fear and respect. Street gangs and neighborhood crews provided both opportunity and competition. Each territory had its own code, its own hierarchy, and its own methods of enforcement. Luciano navigated these structures with a combination of observation and action, gradually learning which battles were worth fighting and which could be avoided or manipulated. He saw how impulsive aggression often led to downfall, and how patience and timing could achieve far greater results. The art of influence, he realized, was rarely about winning every fight, it was about shaping the environment so that others acted in ways that aligned with his objectives. Even small acts of calculated intervention, resolving disputes, mediating conflicts, or strategically threatening rivals, began to build his reputation as someone not just to fear, but to respect and follow. Gambling became another avenue for both profit and psychological mastery. Underground card games, dice operations, and betting rings were not only lucrative but also arenas in which loyalty, skill, and reputation were constantly tested. Luciano quickly grasped that control over gambling extended beyond money, it shaped social dynamics, loyalty, and influence. Those who played, cheated, or attempted to assert dominance without permission risked violent reprisal or ostracization. By carefully managing these operations, Luciano reinforced his understanding of how authority could be exercised without constant confrontation. He was learning the subtle art of influence, discovering that psychological leverage and strategic positioning often outweighed brute force in maintaining power. At the same time, he developed an understanding of law enforcement and the legal system, learning to exploit gaps, corruption, and bureaucracy to his advantage. Bribes, favors, and careful timing became tools to navigate the constant threat of arrest. He observed which precincts were more lenient, which officers could be influenced, and how legal threats could be manipulated as instruments of intimidation against rivals. These lessons in political navigation, earned through careful observation and experimentation, complemented his street acumen, giving him a multidimensional approach to power that few contemporaries possessed. Even as he expanded his criminal activities, Luciano maintained a disciplined approach. Unlike many young gangsters consumed by reckless bravado, he measured risk, calculated outcomes, and anticipated the behavior of both allies and adversaries. He recognized that survival required foresight, and that reputation alone could secure respect or instill fear without constant violence. The streets had taught him patience, the value of alliances, and the mechanics of influence, now he applied those lessons to practical enterprise, laying the foundation for larger operations and a more systemic approach to crime. Each act of ambition, each calculated risk, moved him closer to the realization that crime could be more than chaos, it could be architecture. By the time he had fully entered the underworld, Luciano had already distinguished himself as a figure of emerging authority. He combined intelligence, audacity, and strategic thinking in ways that his peers rarely did, earning a reputation as both dangerous and remarkably capable. He had mastered the subtleties of influence, the mechanics of alliances, and the calculus of risk. More than just a street-level operator, he was beginning to conceptualize a larger system of control, one in which violence was a tool rather than a necessity, where loyalty could be engineered, and where the chaotic energy of the streets could be channeled into profit and enduring influence. The foundations of his empire, initially shaped by petty thefts and bootlegging, were solidifying into a vision that would eventually redefine the entire structure of organized crime in America. Every small venture, every minor conflict, every calculated negotiation was a step toward mastery. He understood that real power was not achieved through force alone, but through perception, strategy, and timing. He observed the fragility of others, the patterns of fear and respect, and the ways in which human behavior could be manipulated to serve larger objectives. Each success reinforced the idea that an organized, disciplined approach could surpass raw strength, and each setback revealed the importance of adaptability and foresight. Through these early ventures, Luciano was not just surviving the streets, he was studying them, learning their language, and preparing to orchestrate them into something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. As Luciano stepped further into the underworld, he quickly realized that raw skill and daring alone were insufficient to rise above the chaos of New York's criminal ecosystem. Survival, influence, and eventual dominance required alliances, carefully chosen partnerships that could amplify power, provide protection, and open doors that might otherwise remain closed. Yet alliances in this world were precarious, loyalty was rarely guaranteed, and betrayal could strike at any moment. The lessons of trust and treachery were learned early and often, shaped not by textbooks or mentors but by experience, observation, and the hard calculus of human behavior. Luciano was already beginning to see the underworld as a complex network of interlocking interests, a system that could be navigated, manipulated, and ultimately controlled by those astute enough to understand its dynamics. His earliest partnerships were forged with figures who commanded respect in the street and who recognized his talent, ambition, and intelligence. These relationships were symbiotic. Luciano offered vision, cunning, and adaptability, while his associates provided muscle, connections, or access to established operations. Together, they could achieve more than the sum of their parts, pooling influence to control territory, manage illicit enterprises, and negotiate disputes without resorting to unnecessary violence. Each alliance was a calculated investment, carefully evaluated for both opportunity and risk. Luciano understood that a single misstep, trusting the wrong partner, misreading ambition, or failing to anticipate jealousy, could unravel months, even years, of progress. In this way, every handshake, every shared operation, and every informal pact was both a test and a strategy, a way to measure loyalty and gauge potential for betrayal. Among his earliest and most formative associations were relationships with older, experienced mobsters who operated within established families. These men offered insight into the mechanisms of power, the subtle rules that governed conduct, and the methods by which influence could be expanded without constant confrontation. Luciano observed the strengths and flaws of his mentors, noting who relied excessively on intimidation, who maintained loyalty through fear alone, and who combined cunning with psychological insight. He was especially attentive to the failures of others, how impulsive aggression led to downfall, how mismanaged alliances bred resentment, and how short-sighted decisions eroded authority. From these observations, he absorbed critical lessons, internalizing the strategies of power and discarding ineffective practices, crafting a philosophy that emphasized foresight, organization, and control over mere force. At the same time, Luciano cultivated relationships with contemporaries, ambitious young men like himself, hungry for status, recognition, and wealth. These peer alliances were more volatile, their loyalties often contingent upon success, personal gain, or the perception of advantage. Yet they were also essential for expanding influence within the rapidly evolving criminal landscape. Luciano recognized that these relationships could be leveraged for mutual benefit, provided that boundaries were clear, incentives aligned, and trust carefully measured. He began to develop a psychological acuity that allowed him to manipulate ambition without alienating potential allies, to reward loyalty while subtly enforcing compliance, and to anticipate threats before they materialized. Every alliance became both a practical tool and a laboratory for understanding the human dynamics that would underpin his rise. Betrayal, of course, was always a looming presence. In the Mafia world of the 1920s and 30s, friendships were provisional, promises often contingent, and ambition relentless. Luciano learned early that power was as much about predicting the behavior of others as it was about asserting dominance. He studied patterns of behavior, monitored rivalries, and calculated the potential consequences of every engagement. A single act of trust misplaced could result in violence, loss of territory, or undermining of credibility. Yet, paradoxically, the constant threat of betrayal also created opportunity. By understanding the motivations and insecurities of those around him, Luciano could preempt treachery, exploit rivalries, and subtly reorient alliances to his advantage. In essence, the volatility of loyalty became an instrument, a resource to be harnessed rather than merely endured. The psychological dimension of these alliances was profound. Luciano realized that influence often hinged less on explicit agreements than on perception, reputation, and the delicate manipulation of ego and fear. A well-timed gesture, a display of strategic generosity, or even the careful withholding of information could secure loyalty and shape behavior. He learned to calibrate intimidation carefully, ensuring it served as a tool to maintain control rather than provoke unnecessary conflict. At the same time, he understood the power of reward and recognition, reinforcing desired behavior through selective praise, promotion, or opportunities for profit. By balancing respect, fear, and incentive, he was able to mold relationships in ways that amplified his authority without triggering resistance, creating a network of individuals whose interests, ambitions, and actions increasingly aligned with his own. Luciano's growing network extended beyond the streets into the broader structures of organized crime, including family ties, ethnic networks, and political connections. He cultivated contacts within influential circles, understanding that power was multidimensional, requiring both social intelligence and strategic negotiation. Through careful observation and selective engagement, he learned how to navigate complex hierarchies, exploit existing tensions, and insert himself into positions of influence where he could shape outcomes. Every alliance, whether forged through friendship, business, or coercion, became a thread in an intricate web of relationships, a web that expanded his reach and reinforced his authority. He understood that the key to dominance was not merely winning conflicts but shaping the environment so that others acted in ways that advanced his objectives, often unknowingly. These early alliances and relationships also provided insight into the psychology of his adversaries. By engaging with both allies and rivals, Luciano studied patterns of ambition, fear, greed, and loyalty. He learned how to predict reactions, manipulate expectations, and exploit weaknesses. This deep understanding of human behavior became a cornerstone of his leadership style, allowing him to exert influence over a wide array of individuals and groups. In effect, each alliance was both a practical tool for expansion and a laboratory for psychological mastery, training him to navigate the subtle, often invisible currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of every interaction. By the time he consolidated his initial network of allies, Luciano was no longer simply a street-level operator. He was emerging as a strategist, a thinker capable of perceiving patterns where others saw only chaos, of converting opportunity into enduring influence, and of balancing fear, respect, and loyalty with calculated precision. These formative relationships were not merely stepping stones, they were the scaffolding on which he would build his empire. The lessons learned through alliances and betrayals, through negotiation and observation, were already shaping his vision of a new criminal order, one that would replace disorganization with structure, impulsivity with foresight, and chaos with control. In the intricate interplay of loyalty and ambition, of trust and deception, Luciano was forging the tools that would allow him to dominate not just a street corner or a gang, but an entire underworld. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved far beyond the chaotic streets that had shaped his youth. He had built alliances, learned the psychology of loyalty and fear, and developed an instinct for strategy that few of his contemporaries could match. Yet the criminal world around him remained fractured, violent, and inefficient. Rival families operated independently, often clashing over territory, profits, and personal slights. Blood feuds were common, and disputes were settled in gunfire rather than negotiation. The Mafia, while powerful, lacked cohesion, organization, and a unifying vision. It was a world of opportunity, but also a world rife with instability. Luciano understood that in order to consolidate real power, he needed to impose order on chaos, to create a system that could endure beyond the volatility of individual tempers and momentary conflicts. This realization marked the birth of the modern Mafia under Luciano's influence. He envisioned an organization that functioned not as a collection of feuding factions but as a disciplined, hierarchical network, structured for efficiency and profit. He introduced concepts that were revolutionary for the time: clear chains of command, division of territories, codified rules of conduct, and centralized coordination of operations. Violence was no longer the first resort, it was a strategic tool to be deployed with precision. By professionalizing crime, he transformed it into a business, one that could be measured, managed, and optimized. Every member had a role, every operation had oversight, and every conflict had a protocol. Chaos, which had once defined the underworld, was now something to be mitigated, predicted, and harnessed. Central to this transformation was the restructuring of Mafia families. Luciano emphasized merit, loyalty, and strategic vision over mere heritage or brute strength. Leadership positions were assigned based on ability and reliability, not just seniority or fear. He encouraged coordination between families, reducing infighting while increasing overall control and profitability. He introduced councils and meetings to settle disputes, allocate territory, and negotiate agreements, creating a forum in which power was exercised with diplomacy as much as with force. This approach not only reduced internal violence but also increased the capacity for large-scale operations, allowing the Mafia to expand its reach across New York and beyond. In essence, Luciano was building a corporate model of crime, where the flow of information, the allocation of resources, and the management of personnel were central to sustained dominance. The introduction of standardized rules of conduct and the codification of loyalty created a predictable structure that both disciplined members and reinforced respect for leadership. Orders were expected to be followed, disputes mediated rather than escalated, and loyalty rewarded while betrayal punished swiftly and decisively. These systems reduced unnecessary risk, increased operational efficiency, and created an environment in which calculated planning could replace impulsive violence. Luciano understood that the underworld's power was not simply in manpower or weaponry, but in the ability to manage people, predict behavior, and control outcomes over time. The Mafia became less about random chaos and more about orchestration, a symphony of calculated moves in which each participant understood their place and the consequences of stepping out of line. Luciano also recognized the importance of diversification and strategic alliances beyond traditional ethnic or family boundaries. He forged partnerships with non-Italian criminals, extending his influence into Jewish, Irish, and other gangs that controlled separate territories or enterprises. These alliances were based on mutual benefit and trust, carefully monitored and enforced, but they represented a significant departure from the insular tendencies of previous Mafia leadership. By integrating diverse actors into his network, Luciano expanded both the reach and flexibility of his operations, allowing the organization to adapt to changing circumstances, exploit new markets, and maintain dominance even in the face of external pressure from law enforcement or rival factions. The organizational changes also extended to the business side of crime. Luciano recognized that profit could be maximized through systematic planning, risk management, and coordinated expansion. Bootlegging, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering were no longer ad hoc operations, they became integrated components of a larger portfolio, each feeding resources and intelligence back into the system. Revenue streams were monitored, operations were protected through both loyalty and intimidation, and disputes were mediated to minimize losses. This business-minded approach allowed the Mafia to amass unprecedented wealth and influence while minimizing the chaos that had previously led to losses, arrests, and violent retaliation. The underworld became, in essence, a criminal corporation with Luciano as its visionary CEO. The introduction of communication networks and trusted lieutenants further enhanced operational efficiency. Messages, orders, and intelligence were carefully controlled and disseminated through a hierarchy of reliable intermediaries. This system ensured that leadership could remain informed, responsive, and in control even across multiple operations and territories. Luciano understood that information was as valuable as money or muscle. Controlling the flow of information meant controlling perception, loyalty, and action. By centralizing decision-making while delegating execution to trusted subordinates, he created a structure in which power could be projected far beyond his immediate presence, allowing him to orchestrate complex operations while maintaining personal security and minimizing exposure. This transformation of the Mafia had profound psychological and cultural effects on its members. Discipline replaced fear-driven obedience as the foundation of loyalty, while predictable rewards and punishments created stability and trust. Members came to understand that their fortunes, security, and status were tied not only to strength or audacity but to adherence to the system. This predictability reduced paranoia and internal conflict, making it easier to focus on expansion, profit, and influence. Luciano's approach shifted the focus from short-term survival to long-term strategy, creating an organization that could endure and thrive even under intense scrutiny and external pressure. The modern Mafia, as he envisioned it, was no longer a chaotic collection of gangs, it was a structured, adaptable, and immensely powerful institution. By the end of this transformation, Luciano had not only consolidated power but had reshaped the very architecture of organized crime in New York. His vision of a disciplined, hierarchical, and strategically minded organization became a model that would be emulated for decades. Violence was harnessed rather than gratuitous, alliances were calculated rather than ad hoc, and operations were coordinated rather than fragmented. The Mafia under Luciano was a system capable of sustaining itself, expanding, and weathering crises, a far cry from the anarchic gangs of the previous generation. He had demonstrated that intelligence, organization, and psychological mastery could surpass brute force, setting the stage for a criminal empire that would endure long after he himself had left the streets. By the time Luciano had consolidated his organizational framework, it became clear that structure and hierarchy alone were insufficient to maintain long-term control. The underworld, by its nature, was volatile, unpredictable, and rife with human frailty. Loyalty could crumble under temptation, fear could be mismanaged, and ambition could become a dangerous force when not guided or restrained. It was in this precarious landscape that Luciano fully understood the necessity of a moral and psychological architecture, a code that would bind his followers, regulate behavior, and create a disciplined culture within the Mafia. This system was not merely about obedience, it was about shaping the mindset of every participant, ensuring that allegiance was earned and maintained through a blend of respect, fear, and mutual benefit. The Code of Omerta, though an existing Sicilian tradition, became under Luciano a refined instrument of control, meticulously adapted to the complexities of the American underworld. Omerta was more than a rule against speaking to the authorities, it was a philosophy, a psychological contract that dictated the behavior of every member, from low-level associates to high-ranking lieutenants. Silence, loyalty, and discretion were paramount. A breach could lead not only to personal ruin but also to the destabilization of the entire organization. Luciano reinforced the code through both example and consequence. He demonstrated that loyalty was rewarded with access to wealth, protection, and opportunity, while betrayal or indiscretion was met with swift and decisive punishment. This dual approach, carrot and stick, ensured that members internalized the code not just as an external rule, but as a personal and practical imperative, a survival strategy in a world where trust was scarce and danger ever present. Beyond the external enforcement of omerta, Luciano mastered the psychological subtleties that made it truly effective. He understood that fear alone was insufficient, it needed to be calibrated carefully, applied in ways that inspired respect rather than panic. Intimidation had to be strategic, demonstrating consequences without undermining morale or loyalty. Conversely, rewards and privileges were used to reinforce obedience and commitment, cultivating a sense of purpose and identity within the group. Members were not simply controlled, they were guided, socialized, and molded into participants in a system that transcended personal ambition. Each individual became an extension of Luciano's vision, a cog in a machine designed for precision, efficiency, and endurance. In this way, the psychological dimension of control was as critical as the operational and structural components of his empire. Omerta also provided a framework for managing conflict, both internal and external. Disputes between members were mediated with reference to established rules and precedents, reducing the risk of impulsive violence that could destabilize operations. Rivalries, grievances, and jealousies were channeled into predictable and manageable outlets, ensuring that the organization could continue functioning even under stress. This predictability was invaluable in an environment where chaos and uncertainty were constants. By embedding psychological and ethical guidance into daily operations, Luciano created a culture in which discipline and loyalty became self-reinforcing, reducing the need for constant oversight while increasing stability and resilience. The code also extended to interactions with outsiders, including rival gangs, business partners, and political authorities. Luciano understood that secrecy, discretion, and controlled communication were essential for operational security. Intelligence was tightly guarded, alliances were formalized through calculated trust, and breaches of protocol were punished swiftly to maintain credibility. Omerta, therefore, was not only a tool for internal cohesion but also a strategic instrument for navigating the broader criminal ecosystem. It allowed Luciano's organization to operate in a world filled with surveillance, informants, and shifting alliances while maintaining continuity and strategic advantage. The psychological effect of this code extended beyond his immediate circle, signaling to competitors and law enforcement alike that the organization was disciplined, loyal, and resilient, qualities that commanded both fear and respect. In practice, Luciano applied omerta not only as a passive principle but as an active instrument of leadership. He cultivated loyalty by identifying and nurturing talent, ensuring that individuals felt both invested in and rewarded for their allegiance. He tested commitment through controlled challenges, carefully observing reactions to stress, temptation, and threat. By doing so, he was able to identify reliability, manipulate ambition, and reinforce the internal hierarchy. The code became a lens through which he could interpret behavior, predict outcomes, and manage both people and events. Loyalty was not assumed, it was actively cultivated and maintained, a living, dynamic aspect of organizational control. Each member understood that their success, security, and advancement were directly tied to their adherence to the principles of omerta. Moreover, omerta contributed to the mythos of the Mafia, creating a perception of invulnerability and cohesion. Members internalized a sense of honor, secrecy, and identity that transcended personal gain, binding them psychologically to the collective. The reputation of the organization, carefully cultivated through discipline, discretion, and strategic displays of power, reinforced compliance and deterred defection. By embedding moral and psychological imperatives into the culture of the underworld, Luciano ensured that his system was more than just rules, it became a shared understanding, an ethos that guided decisions, behavior, and ambition. This psychological architecture allowed him to command respect without constant oversight, maintain loyalty through both fear and incentive, and exert influence far beyond his immediate physical presence. In essence, the Code of Omerta under Luciano was a sophisticated instrument of organizational psychology. It harmonized fear, respect, loyalty, and discipline into a coherent system that enhanced both efficiency and security. It transformed the Mafia from a collection of violent, unpredictable gangs into a coordinated, resilient, and psychologically cohesive institution. Members understood their role not simply as criminals, but as participants in a system with clear rules, consequences, and rewards. By embedding ethical and psychological control into the fabric of his empire, Luciano ensured that his power was durable, his influence pervasive, and his organization capable of enduring challenges that would have destroyed less disciplined leadership. The code was not merely tradition, it was a blueprint for control, a mechanism by which Luciano translated insight, strategy, and psychological mastery into lasting authority over a world defined by uncertainty and danger. By the time Lucky Luciano had solidified his organizational structure and psychological control over his followers, he turned his attention fully to the business of crime. The underworld, once defined primarily by raw violence, territorial disputes, and chaotic competition, could now be systematically transformed into a highly profitable enterprise. Luciano recognized that crime, when approached with the same strategic rigor as a legitimate business, could yield unprecedented wealth and influence. He saw patterns where others saw only disorder, understanding that vice was not merely an outlet for lawlessness, but a commodity to be refined, controlled, and monetized. Prohibition, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering were not just opportunities, they were industries, each with its own markets, supply chains, and operational risks. Luciano approached them with the precision of a corporate executive, blending ambition with strategy and human insight with financial calculation. Bootlegging remained the most lucrative avenue. Speakeasies, clandestine bars, and underground liquor operations thrived across the city, and the public's demand for alcohol was insatiable. Luciano recognized that controlling production, distribution, and enforcement simultaneously could maximize profits while minimizing losses. He cultivated trusted contacts in breweries, distilleries, and shipping operations, ensuring a reliable supply of liquor. Distribution networks were carefully mapped, with territory divided among loyal associates, reducing conflict and streamlining operations. Enforcement of payment and compliance was strategic rather than arbitrary, applying pressure where necessary and rewarding cooperation elsewhere. In this way, Luciano turned what had once been a dangerous, chaotic trade into a disciplined, efficient, and highly profitable enterprise, creating a blueprint for organized crime as a business. Gambling operations offered another avenue of immense wealth. Underground casinos, card games, horse betting, and dice operations attracted a clientele eager to risk money and indulge in vice. Luciano realized that the key to successful gambling enterprises lay not merely in controlling the venues, but in controlling perception, trust, and opportunity. Rules had to be enforced, cheating had to be punished, and reputations managed carefully. By creating a network of trusted operators, he ensured both compliance and profitability. Gambling was not only a source of revenue, it was a tool for influence. High rollers, businesspeople, and politicians were drawn into his orbit, indebted to him in subtle and overt ways. Every operation became a nexus of both wealth and leverage, a system where financial and social power were inseparable. Extortion and protection rackets were equally refined under Luciano's guidance. Unlike the random, violent intimidation of earlier gangs, these operations were calculated and psychologically nuanced. Business owners, union leaders, and other targets were approached with a mixture of coercion, negotiation, and demonstration of power. Payments were framed as necessary for security and stability, not merely as tribute. Luciano understood that fear could be a motivator, but respect and a sense of inevitability were far more effective over the long term. By providing a perceived service, enforcing rules selectively, and demonstrating consequences for non-compliance, he created a system in which extortion was not only profitable, but also relatively stable and predictable, a radical departure from the disorganized intimidation of previous eras. Labor racketeering was another pillar of his strategy, and perhaps the most sophisticated. By infiltrating unions, influencing strikes, and controlling contracts, Luciano gained leverage over industries critical to the city's economy. This allowed him not only to extract wealth directly through kickbacks and bribes, but also to shape broader economic outcomes in ways that advanced his interests. He understood that control over labor created leverage far beyond immediate profit, it created influence over politicians, business leaders, and other powerful actors. By coordinating these operations with his other enterprises, Luciano built a network of interdependent revenue streams, each reinforcing the other, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of power and wealth. His operations were no longer isolated acts of crime, they were interlinked components of a vast, highly organized economic machine. Crucially, Luciano integrated meticulous record-keeping, accountability, and financial oversight into his criminal enterprises, distinguishing them from the ad hoc operations of prior generations. Ledgers, communications, and personal oversight ensured that revenue flows were monitored, that operations remained efficient, and that risks were identified and mitigated before they became crises. This level of organization reduced waste, minimized internal disputes, and allowed the empire to scale far beyond the capacity of individual street gangs. Crime was not merely an art of risk, it was a system of management, planning, and execution, a lesson in both human behavior and economic optimization. Luciano's understanding of human psychology was as critical to his business success as his operational oversight. He recognized that people responded not just to money, but to status, fear, and perceived opportunity. By carefully calibrating incentives and punishments, he motivated associates to act in ways that reinforced the stability and profitability of the enterprise. Loyalty was cultivated not solely through threats, but through empowerment, reward, and shared identity. Employees, lieutenants, and partners all understood that their success was intertwined with the larger system, creating a disciplined workforce capable of executing complex operations with precision. By combining business acumen with psychological insight, Luciano turned criminal operations into a self-reinforcing machine, both profitable and remarkably resilient. Furthermore, Luciano was adept at managing the optics of his operations. The perception of strength, inevitability, and organizational sophistication was as important as the actual execution of business. Competitors, law enforcement, and the public alike perceived his organization as disciplined, controlled, and strategically superior. This perception acted as a deterrent to rivals, a signal to potential allies, and a reassurance to those within his network that loyalty and obedience were rational choices. In this way, Luciano monetized not only crime itself but the reputation and psychological leverage associated with power, demonstrating an advanced understanding of both economics and social influence. By transforming crime into a disciplined business, Luciano reshaped the very nature of organized crime in America. He created a model in which strategy, human insight, operational control, and financial oversight were integrated seamlessly. Profit was maximized, risk minimized, and loyalty managed through psychological and material incentives. What had once been chaotic, violent, and unpredictable became predictable, systematic, and scalable. Under Luciano's leadership, the underworld became an enterprise not merely driven by opportunity, but by calculated strategy, a world in which crime was as much about management and influence as it was about audacity and force. The Mafia was no longer merely a collection of gangs, it was a business empire with Luciano at its helm, a blueprint for organized crime that would endure for generations. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had firmly established himself as a central figure in New York's underworld, but power rarely existed in isolation. The consolidation of control and the creation of a structured, disciplined criminal enterprise inevitably drew attention, both from ambitious rivals within the Mafia and from external forces like law enforcement, politicians, and competing gangs. Allies were essential, but enemies were equally consequential. Understanding this duality, Luciano navigated a treacherous landscape in which betrayal, competition, and shifting loyalties were constants. Every relationship was layered with risk, every alliance weighed against potential treachery, and every action carefully calibrated to maintain an edge. The underworld was a chessboard, and Luciano played with both foresight and ruthlessness, anticipating moves before they were made and orchestrating events to ensure that advantage always fell in his favor. His allies were carefully chosen, each bringing specific skills, influence, or connections that enhanced the broader enterprise. Figures such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel exemplified this approach, men with intelligence, ambition, and loyalty, whose abilities complemented Luciano's strategic vision. Lansky, with his financial acumen and understanding of broader criminal networks, became instrumental in coordinating complex operations, particularly in gambling and international ventures. Siegel brought audacity and a willingness to execute bold, high-risk actions. Together, this inner circle operated as both a council of strategists and an enforcement arm, capable of executing Luciano's plans while managing day-to-day operations. Loyalty was earned through competence and shared success, and betrayal carried consequences severe enough to deter even the most ambitious members from straying. This inner circle was the engine that transformed Luciano's vision into reality, allowing him to extend influence far beyond the streets of New York. At the same time, rivals emerged, drawn by opportunity or threatened by Luciano's growing dominance. These adversaries were not mere obstacles, they were forces that tested his strategic acuity, resilience, and ability to manage conflict without destabilizing the entire organization. Figures such as Salvatore Maranzano, Joe Masuria, and other family heads represented both competition and existential threat. Maranzano, in particular, sought to consolidate Italian-American organized crime under his own authority, envisioning a hierarchy where loyalty was commanded rather than negotiated. Luciano recognized the danger posed by such rivals but also perceived their weaknesses, their reliance on outdated structures, overemphasis on intimidation, and inability to adapt to modern, systematized criminal enterprise. By exploiting these vulnerabilities, he could turn potential confrontation into opportunity, undermining rivals strategically rather than merely reacting with violence. Betrayal was a constant undercurrent in this environment. Friends could become enemies, and alliances were often provisional, contingent on perceived advantage. Luciano mastered the art of preempting betrayal by observing behavior, understanding ambition, and carefully controlling information. He orchestrated situations to test loyalty, manipulate rivalries, and anticipate threats before they materialized. Psychological insight became as critical as physical force, understanding fear, desire, and ego allowed him to shape the actions of allies and enemies alike. Strategic preemption, whether through negotiation, calculated intimidation, or orchestrated elimination, became a hallmark of his approach, demonstrating that power was maintained not just through strength, but through foresight, calculation, and manipulation of perception. The tensions between allies and rivals often played out in dramatic, high-stakes confrontations. Negotiations were rarely purely verbal. Subtle threats, displays of power, and carefully timed interventions conveyed intentions and tested resolve. Each encounter was both tactical and psychological, a performance in which observation and timing determined outcomes. Luciano understood that dominance was as much about perception as action. Competitors who underestimated him or misread his intentions were often neutralized or co-opted, while those who challenged him directly faced consequences calibrated to send clear signals to others. In this way, every act of confrontation or diplomacy served both immediate and long-term strategic objectives, reinforcing his authority while maintaining the cohesion of his network. Alliances were also shaped by pragmatic considerations that transcended personal loyalty. Ethnic, cultural, and criminal divides were bridged when mutual profit could be secured, creating networks that were as practical as they were strategic. Luciano leveraged relationships with Jewish, Irish, and other non-Italian gangs, integrating them into coordinated operations that enhanced both reach and flexibility. These alliances required careful management, as each partner brought competing ambitions and loyalties. Through negotiation, strategic incentives, and selective displays of force, Luciano maintained cohesion while exploiting the diverse strengths of his network. He understood that his power depended not solely on unilateral command, but on the ability to orchestrate a coalition in which multiple actors acted in alignment with his broader vision, often without overt coercion. The psychological stakes of these dynamics were immense. Every interaction, whether with ally or rival, was a test of insight, patience, and strategy. Luciano understood that perception shaped reality. If allies believed in his authority and rivals feared his reach, the organization could operate with efficiency and minimal disruption. Reputation, carefully cultivated through calculated actions, ensured compliance and deterred defection. He recognized that dominance required more than temporary victories, it required the establishment of a system in which others internalized his authority, acted predictably, and reinforced his strategic objectives. This intricate interplay of power, fear, loyalty, and perception defined the way Luciano managed both friendship and enmity, transforming the chaotic world of street gangs into a controlled, hierarchical, and durable empire. Through these alliances and rivalries, Luciano demonstrated a capacity for strategic patience and ruthless efficiency that set him apart from his contemporaries. He did not rely solely on brute force, he relied on intelligence, foresight, and careful orchestration of human behavior. By balancing loyalty and fear, reward and punishment, alliance and rivalry, he ensured that his organization remained cohesive, adaptable, and profitable even under pressure. Every decision, negotiation, and confrontation was part of a larger calculus, aimed at consolidating power, neutralizing threats, and securing long-term dominance. In this delicate equilibrium of human ambition and calculated influence, Luciano's genius as both a strategist and a psychologist became unmistakable, cementing his place at the apex of organized crime. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had reached a scale and sophistication unprecedented in American organized crime, but with power came constant threats, both visible and invisible. The underworld was no longer merely a network of street-level operations and clandestine vice, it had evolved into a sprawling enterprise that attracted attention from law enforcement, political authorities, and rival factions alike. The complexity and profitability of his operations made him a target, and the stakes of survival had never been higher. It was in this environment that Luciano's capacity for strategy, psychological insight, and meticulous planning was tested in ways that would define the course of his life. The hidden war he faced was not fought solely with guns or intimidation, it was waged through intelligence, manipulation, alliances, and the careful orchestration of both perception and reality. Government pressure intensified during this period, fueled by political will, media scrutiny, and public outrage over the scale of organized crime. Federal agencies and local law enforcement agencies sought to dismantle syndicates, disrupt operations, and prosecute leaders. Investigations, surveillance, and undercover operations increased the risk for even the most cautious operators. Luciano understood that visibility was dangerous, and he adapted accordingly. He developed layers of intermediaries and lieutenants to shield himself from exposure, delegating responsibilities while maintaining oversight. Communication was tightly controlled, orders were relayed selectively, coded, or passed through trusted associates. By insulating himself from direct evidence of criminal activity, Luciano minimized vulnerability while ensuring that operations continued uninterrupted. His ability to survive this scrutiny relied not just on luck, but on foresight, discipline, and the intelligent management of risk. Within the Mafia itself, hidden conflicts simmered beneath the surface. Long-standing rivalries, disputes over territory, and resentment stemming from earlier alliances threatened to destabilize the organization. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to anticipate and manipulate these tensions, turning potential threats into instruments of consolidation. He orchestrated interventions, mediated disputes, and, when necessary, applied calculated violence to enforce discipline. But unlike impulsive predecessors, he deployed force selectively, always considering the long-term strategic impact. By combining diplomacy, negotiation, and psychological leverage with the occasional act of brutal efficiency, he maintained cohesion while neutralizing threats. The hidden war of the underworld was as much about managing human behavior and ambition as it was about physical confrontation. The threat of betrayal from within the organization demanded constant vigilance. Associates could be tempted by law enforcement deals, rival gangs, or personal ambition. Luciano developed methods to test loyalty, monitor behavior, and anticipate defection before it occurred. Surveillance of associates, careful management of sensitive information, and subtle psychological tests ensured that betrayal could be identified early. By controlling the flow of knowledge and maintaining clear hierarchies of trust, he reduced the likelihood of unexpected treachery. Each decision, alliance, and promotion was evaluated not only for immediate utility but also for potential risks to stability and loyalty. This constant attention to human behavior became as critical to survival as the operational and financial aspects of the enterprise itself. Luciano also mastered the use of influence beyond his immediate criminal network. Political figures, union leaders, and law enforcement officials were often amenable to manipulation through bribes, favors, or strategic alliances. By carefully cultivating these relationships, he created a buffer against external pressure, allowing operations to continue with reduced interference. These relationships were dynamic and required continual management. The alignment of interests had to be maintained, threats mitigated, and obligations fulfilled. The interplay between power, persuasion, and pragmatism became a defining feature of his strategy. Luciano understood that the hidden war was fought as much in the corridors of influence as in the alleys of the city, and he deployed his resources accordingly, blending diplomacy, intimidation, and negotiation with extraordinary skill. International connections also provided an additional layer of both opportunity and security. Luciano leveraged contacts in Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America to diversify operations, manage risk, and secure safe channels for smuggling and financial transactions. These international networks were carefully cultivated to enhance both profitability and resilience. They provided alternative avenues of operation in case of domestic disruption and created layers of complexity that confounded law enforcement efforts. Luciano's understanding of global criminal logistics, combined with his psychological insight into the behavior of associates and rivals alike, made his empire remarkably adaptable. Even when confronted with intensified scrutiny and internal pressure, the structure and reach of his organization allowed him to maintain dominance. The hidden war also extended to personal survival. Luciano had to navigate threats from both rivals seeking his elimination and associates whose ambitions could destabilize the organization. He cultivated an acute awareness of timing, opportunity, and perception, ensuring that he was rarely caught off guard. Strategic patience became a hallmark of his approach. He knew when to act decisively and when to allow tensions to simmer, leveraging uncertainty to his advantage. By controlling the narrative, shaping expectations, and carefully orchestrating both visible and invisible actions, he remained several steps ahead of potential threats. Survival was not left to chance, it was designed, calculated, and executed with precision. Through these hidden conflicts, Luciano's reputation grew not only as a master of organization but as a tactician capable of navigating the most dangerous circumstances with intelligence and foresight. Allies and rivals alike came to recognize that his power was as much psychological and strategic as it was operational. By managing risk, loyalty, and perception with meticulous care, he transformed the underworld from a landscape of unpredictable violence into a controlled environment in which his authority could be projected with consistency and reliability. The hidden war, with its pressures, dangers, and subtleties, became both a proving ground and a demonstration of his unique capacity for leadership, strategy, and survival in a world defined by instability and danger. Despite years of meticulous planning, alliances, and control, the empire Luciano had built was never entirely immune to exposure. The underworld, by its nature, was fraught with unpredictability, and even the most disciplined structures could be compromised by ambition, carelessness, or circumstance. By the late 1930s, the combined forces of law enforcement pressure, media scrutiny, and internal instability began to converge against him. Prohibition had ended, yet the profits of organized crime remained enormous, making the underworld a high-stakes arena of competition and risk. Luciano had spent years insulating himself from direct evidence of illegal activities, delegating operations to trusted lieutenants, and cultivating both psychological and practical mechanisms of control, but the growing attention of authorities and the emergence of informants created cracks in his carefully constructed armor. The beginning of his fall was subtle, creeping into his world like a shadow, yet it would mark a dramatic turning point in the story of his life. The first signs were internal betrayals, as ambitious associates and discontented lieutenants began to test the boundaries of loyalty. Human ambition, ever unpredictable, could not be entirely managed through fear, reward, or psychological insight. Small missteps, unauthorized dealings, whispered negotiations with rivals, or lapses in discipline, began to ripple through the organization. Luciano, ever perceptive, recognized these as early warning signs. He responded with a mix of diplomacy and calculated intimidation, seeking to reassert control while preventing the eruption of open conflict that could destabilize operations. Yet these early betrayals revealed a key vulnerability: even the most loyal allies could be tempted by opportunity or pressured by authorities, and no system, however sophisticated, was entirely immune to human fallibility. Law enforcement pressure intensified as federal investigations targeted key figures in organized crime. The success of Luciano's structured approach and his widespread influence had made him a person of immense interest. Agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and local police forces began to monitor, infiltrate, and compile evidence on his operations. Investigators sought to penetrate the veil of intermediaries, uncover the mechanisms behind gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering, and establish direct links to Luciano himself. The strategy of insulation that had protected him for years now required constant vigilance and rapid adaptation. Every interaction, every transaction, and every communication carried risk. Luciano understood that his empire could be dismantled not just by violence, but by the careful application of legal and investigative pressure, and he prepared accordingly. The arrest itself was a carefully orchestrated, high-stakes moment that would shake the foundation of the organization. Charges of compulsory prostitution, bribery, and other criminal activities culminated in a legal onslaught designed to publicly expose Luciano's influence and disrupt his operations. For the first time, the carefully managed perception of invulnerability was threatened. Media coverage framed him as both a mastermind and a public enemy, amplifying the sense of menace and fascination surrounding his persona. The courtroom became a stage, a crucible in which his reputation, authority, and psychological dominance were tested under intense scrutiny. This trial, though legal in nature, was deeply personal, revealing the fragility of human ambition and the precariousness of power in a world where law, betrayal, and circumstance intersected. Amid the legal pressures, betrayal by allies emerged as a defining factor in the erosion of his empire. Informants, cooperative witnesses, and opportunistic rivals capitalized on the situation, undermining previously stable relationships and exposing vulnerabilities that Luciano had long shielded. The delicate psychological balance that had maintained loyalty within the organization now required extraordinary effort to preserve. He had to navigate shifting allegiances, quell dissent, and reinforce the perception of control even as evidence mounted against him. The interplay of fear, respect, and reward that had once ensured near-universal compliance now faced its most serious test. Luciano's response was methodical and calculated, demonstrating both the resilience of his strategic mind and the harsh reality that no system, no matter how sophisticated, was impervious to the combined forces of human ambition and institutional pressure. Even in the midst of arrest and trial, Luciano demonstrated an ability to manipulate perception and maintain influence. He projected calm, confidence, and control, signaling to associates that his authority remained intact despite external appearances. This psychological projection was as important as any operational maneuver, reassuring loyalists and deterring potential rivals from taking advantage of perceived weakness. Through careful communication, selective delegation, and subtle displays of power, he managed to preserve cohesion within the organization, demonstrating a rare mastery of human psychology under extreme stress. Yet the risk of further exposure, betrayal, and legal consequences loomed large, marking the beginning of a prolonged struggle to protect both his empire and his personal freedom. The consequences of these events were multifaceted. While Luciano retained elements of control and influence, the arrest and early betrayals marked a turning point, signaling that the mechanisms which had allowed him to dominate the underworld were no longer entirely secure. Relationships that had been stable for years were tested, operational efficiency was disrupted, and the psychological equilibrium that had maintained loyalty was destabilized. The beginning of his downfall was both practical and symbolic. His empire faced external threats in the form of law enforcement and rivals, and internal fragility as human ambition and betrayal began to erode the foundation of loyalty he had painstakingly constructed. It was a moment that highlighted the delicate interplay of strategy, psychology, and circumstance that defined not only Luciano's rise but also the vulnerabilities inherent in any complex system of power. Ultimately, The early phase of Luciano's fall revealed the duality of his genius. His strategic foresight, organizational skill, and psychological insight allowed him to maintain a degree of authority even under unprecedented pressure. Yet it also exposed the limits of control, the inevitability of betrayal, and the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated criminal empire to both internal and external forces. This period set the stage for the subsequent trials, sentencing, and exile that would redefine his life and legacy, illustrating the dramatic arc of power, hubris, and consequence that characterizes the story of one of the most influential figures in American organized crime. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle that illuminated the intricate tension between criminal genius and societal morality. For the first time, the meticulous architecture of his empire was laid bare under the harsh light of the courtroom, exposing the mechanisms of power, influence, and organized crime that had long operated in shadows. Media coverage was relentless, framing the narrative as a battle between law and lawlessness, morality and ambition, order and chaos. The public became enthralled by the figure of Luciano, not merely a criminal, but a symbol of audacity, intelligence, and defiance. The courtroom itself became a stage, and Luciano, ever aware of perception and psychological effect, navigated it with careful calculation, projecting composure, control, and the subtle confidence of a man who had always been several steps ahead. Inside the courtroom, the stakes were monumental. Prosecutors presented evidence detailing the scale and sophistication of Luciano's operations, gambling syndicates, prostitution rings, labor racketeering, and complex networks of bribery and corruption. Witnesses testified to acts of coercion, manipulation, and intimidation. The meticulous structure that had once ensured loyalty and operational efficiency was now being dissected, analyzed, and exposed to a public eager for spectacle. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, threatened not only Luciano's freedom but also the stability of the empire he had built. The tension was palpable, the courtroom became a crucible in which power, strategy, and reputation were tested against the relentless machinery of law and media scrutiny. Yet Luciano's approach to the trial demonstrated the same strategic acumen that had characterized his rise. He understood that perception could influence outcomes as much as facts or legal arguments. He projected an image of calm, intelligence, and rationality, subtly commanding the attention and respect of jurors, the press, and the public. His demeanor suggested that he was not merely a figure at the mercy of the law, but a calculating mind assessing every element of the situation, aware of both immediate consequences and long-term implications. In doing so, he maintained influence over allies and lieutenants outside the courtroom, signaling that leadership remained intact despite the external pressures and exposing the limits of law enforcement's ability to project fear over a carefully constructed network. The trial also revealed the fragility of loyalty within the underworld. While many associates remained steadfast, some were persuaded or coerced into cooperation with prosecutors. Testimonies from informants, betrayals of trust, and strategic leaks undermined both the perception and reality of invulnerability. For Luciano, each act of disloyalty was a moment for calculated response. He analyzed motives, assessed risk, and deployed strategic interventions, whether through negotiation, intimidation, or manipulation, to mitigate damage and reinforce discipline. The courtroom, in this sense, became a battlefield of both law and psychology, where control, loyalty, and perception were continually contested, and where every move had implications far beyond the immediate legal consequences. Sentencing, when it came, was both symbolic and practical. Luciano was convicted, a dramatic confirmation of law's capacity to challenge power, yet the broader implications extended beyond personal punishment. The sentence signaled to associates, rivals, and society that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises were vulnerable. It created a temporary power vacuum, a space in which loyalties were tested and ambitions recalibrated. Yet, even behind bars, Luciano continued to wield influence. The systems he had built, hierarchies of trust, delegated authority, and tightly controlled communication, allowed him to maintain operational oversight. Prison, though restrictive, did not fully sever his connection to the empire. His capacity to project authority under duress reinforced both his mythos and the enduring structural power of the organization he had meticulously engineered. The media played a critical role in shaping both public perception and internal dynamics. Newspaper coverage, radio broadcasts, and sensationalized reporting amplified Luciano's persona, framing him simultaneously as a criminal mastermind and a figure of fascination. Public discourse debated morality, ambition, and the nature of organized crime, often blurring the line between admiration and condemnation. This amplification of his mythos had strategic consequences. Associates were reminded of the consequences of loyalty or betrayal, rivals were measured against his legacy, and authorities grappled with the challenge of controlling a figure whose influence transcended physical presence. Luciano understood that perception was as potent a tool as legal maneuvering or physical control, and he used it to reinforce both internal cohesion and external deterrence. The courtroom drama also highlighted the interplay between law, politics, and power in the era of the 1930s. Corruption, political influence, and the limitations of law enforcement were laid bare, demonstrating that criminal dominance was as much a product of societal structures as individual audacity. Luciano's operations had thrived within these systemic gaps, exploiting both human psychology and institutional inefficiency. The trial revealed these dynamics to the public, creating a narrative in which organized crime was not merely an individual failure but a reflection of broader societal vulnerabilities. In navigating this complex environment, Luciano displayed not only survival instincts but an acute understanding of how systemic forces could be leveraged, manipulated, or mitigated to maintain influence and authority even in the face of unprecedented scrutiny. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing represented both a turning point and a continuation of Luciano's strategic narrative. They marked the first major, visible erosion of his freedom, yet also underscored the durability of the systems he had constructed. Even as law imposed physical constraints, the psychological, organizational, and operational architecture of his empire remained resilient. Through projection, strategic influence, and careful orchestration of internal and external relationships, Luciano demonstrated that power was not solely contingent upon freedom of movement, but upon the ability to control perception, loyalty, and the mechanisms of an enterprise. The trial became a testament not only to law's reach but also to the genius and adaptability of a man who had transformed organized crime into a disciplined, resilient, and enduring institution. Even behind the imposing walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence did not wane. Confinement, which might have crushed the ambitions of lesser men, became for him another arena to exercise control, strategy, and psychological mastery. From his cell, Luciano continued to orchestrate operations with remarkable precision, using a network of loyal lieutenants, intermediaries, and carefully cultivated contacts to relay orders, monitor compliance, and adapt strategies. The empire he had built was resilient precisely because it did not depend on his physical presence. Systems, hierarchies, and norms were firmly entrenched. Yet he understood that maintaining power in captivity required a nuanced approach, blending subtlety, influence, and foresight. Every message, every instruction, and every decision was carefully calibrated to reinforce authority, preserve cohesion, and ensure that loyalty remained unbroken despite the distance and constraints imposed by incarceration. Luciano's continued command was made possible by the structures he had meticulously designed during his rise. Each operation, from gambling and bootlegging to labor racketeering and union influence, had layers of intermediaries who could execute directives while shielding him from direct exposure. These lieutenants were not merely employees, they were invested participants in a system that rewarded compliance and punished deviation. The psychological mechanisms of loyalty and obedience, which had been embedded through fear, respect, and incentive, allowed Luciano to exert control remotely. Even from prison, he remained the central node in a network whose complexity and efficiency ensured that his strategic vision continued to unfold. In this sense, incarceration was less a limitation than a test of the durability of his empire, one which he passed through foresight, organization, and psychological insight. Prison also presented opportunities for influence beyond the traditional underworld. Luciano recognized that organized criminal activity intersected with political and societal forces, and he used his confinement to cultivate relationships with officials, prison staff, and intermediaries who could be leveraged to advantage. Whether through negotiation, persuasion, or strategic cooperation, he maintained channels of influence that extended beyond the walls of his cell. These connections allowed him not only to continue operations but to anticipate and mitigate threats, exert pressure on rivals, and ensure that the organization's stability remained intact. In this environment, power was a product not merely of force or proximity, but of strategy, intellect, and the subtle manipulation of human behavior. The psychological dimension of Luciano's continued authority was equally critical. He understood that perception shaped behavior, and that even hints of weakness could destabilize loyalty and embolden rivals. By projecting confidence, calm, and strategic foresight, he reinforced the belief that his authority remained absolute. Communications, visits, and controlled interactions were carefully managed to reinforce this perception. Lieutenants, associates, and even adversaries were constantly reminded of the consequences of defection, the rewards of loyalty, and the enduring reach of Luciano's influence. In this way, power became less about immediate physical dominance and more about the enduring control of minds, motivations, and expectations, a testament to his understanding of human psychology as a tool of leadership. Despite the constraints of confinement, Luciano's strategic acumen allowed him to navigate both internal and external challenges. Rival factions within the underworld sought advantage, law enforcement continued to monitor operations, and emerging threats tested the resilience of his network. Luciano responded with calculated interventions, ensuring that potential disruptions were neutralized before they could escalate. He communicated selectively, reinforced hierarchies, and applied both reward and subtle intimidation to maintain compliance. The discipline and foresight embedded in the organization allowed it to function efficiently, even in his physical absence. In many ways, prison became a stage for the demonstration of his genius, an environment in which intellect, planning, and psychological mastery compensated for the loss of freedom. Luciano's influence behind bars also highlighted the enduring importance of trust and loyalty. The organization's functioning depended on a network of individuals who were not merely executing orders mechanically, but internalizing the principles of control, discipline, and strategic compliance. This trust was reinforced by incentives, mutual dependence, and a shared understanding of the stakes involved. The psychological and operational architecture of his empire proved robust, capable of withstanding pressure that would have undone a less carefully constructed organization. His continued authority was a testament not only to personal skill but to the effectiveness of the systems he had implemented, systems that translated insight into action, loyalty into obedience, and influence into tangible operational outcomes. The period of incarceration also became a moment of observation and learning for Luciano. Confined to a controlled environment, he studied behavior, identified emerging threats, and refined his understanding of organizational dynamics. This experience reinforced the lessons that had guided his rise. Power depended not merely on control of resources or territory, but on the ability to manage perception, anticipate human behavior, and design systems that could function independently of any single individual. Even in adversity, Luciano turned limitations into strategic advantage, demonstrating a resilience and adaptability that few in the underworld could match. In essence, Luciano's power behind bars revealed the depth and sophistication of his approach to control. Physical confinement could restrict movement, but it could not diminish the influence of a mind capable of orchestrating loyalty, fear, and compliance across an intricate network. The empire he had built was resilient because it was not dependent on physical presence alone, it was sustained by systems, psychology, and strategic oversight. His continued authority from prison underscored a fundamental truth of his legacy, that power is most durable when it operates through structure, insight, and influence, rather than raw force alone. Even in the most constrained circumstances, Luciano remained a master of the underworld, guiding operations with precision, shaping behavior with psychological insight, and demonstrating that true authority transcends the limitations of physical freedom. After years behind bars, Lucky Luciano faced deportation to Sicily in 1946, a dramatic disruption to the empire he had meticulously built. New York had been mapped in his mind, its criminal networks organized with precision, and his authority carefully cultivated. Exile threatened to sever his physical control, yet Luciano approached it with the same calculated insight that had defined his rise. Sicily was both familiar and foreign, the culture reminiscent of his upbringing, yet the power structures and social dynamics had evolved during his absence. Luciano had to navigate this new landscape strategically, relying on observation, negotiation, and psychological insight to maintain relevance. Even in exile, his influence in American organized crime persisted. Communications with trusted lieutenants and intermediaries allowed him to shape decisions, mediate disputes, and provide guidance. Reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, ensured that his symbolic authority commanded respect. Allies and rivals alike understood that physical absence did not equate to diminished power, his intellect and strategic vision continued to operate across continents. Exile also became a period of reflection, forcing Luciano to confront the personal costs of his ambition, the isolation, the loss of daily control, and the fragility of even the most disciplined systems in the face of external forces. In Sicily, he also practiced a subtler form of influence, negotiating relationships with local authorities and criminal figures while respecting existing hierarchies. Exile revealed the resilience of his empire, the durability of loyalty, and the psychological depth of his leadership. It was a period of adaptation, reflection, and enduring strategic presence. Though removed from the epicenter of power, Luciano remained a master of human behavior and organizational dynamics, demonstrating that true authority transcends geography, physical freedom, and circumstance, cementing his place as one of the most influential figures in organized crime history.